Alright, I know we all have our flaws and nobody is perfect, but in general, I think that we all could agree that it's a good plan to treat others with respect, be kind, and do the right thing as much as possible. If you read the title of this video though, you know we're not here to talk about people who are just doing good in the world out of the kindness of their heart. We're instead diving into a list of people who have found themselves with a pretty bad rap based on their actions this past year. As I was scanning headlines for today's episode, I was actually pretty surprised to learn that New York City actually has an official Worst Landlord Watchlist, which updates every year and highlights the worst landlords in the city based on how many buildings they own and how many outstanding violations that they have at those buildings. This list is meticulously put together, is organized in order of how bad these landlords really are, and it is jam-packed with information including everything from the building addresses to the number of evictions and violations that happened at that building in the past year. In today's video, we are going to talk about how buildings and landlords end up on this watch list. We'll get into what the most common types of violations are, and we'll take a look at some photos of some buildings that ended up with the worst number of violations from this list. By the end of this video, I think that we will all have had a lesson learned on exactly what not to do if you're a landlord in New York City. So let's get into it, but before we do, really quick, I just want to give a shout out to everybody who's hitting the like button on my videos and everybody who's consistently posting nice comments. I know it's not necessary to hit the like button or post a comment, but it really means a lot to me and it helps my channel out a ton. We need to kick this video off by defining what a landlord is, and I want to make it perfectly clear that landlords in general are not inherently bad. Sometimes real estate investors and landlords get a bad rap, especially in an environment where real estate prices and rents are going through the roof. But I'm a landlord myself, and the last thing I want to do in this video is paint a picture that all landlords are bad. A landlord is very simply somebody who owns a piece of real estate and rents it out to a tenant. And you can see in this chart, which is a few years old, but it's from census data, that most landlords are just individuals who own a few units. It's about 14 million regular individual investors who own just 1 to 4 total units, which make up the majority of landlords. Who we're talking about on our list today generally do not fall into this bucket of a regular individual investor, because the top 10 worst landlords in New York all own 200 to 300 units in total. When you're an individual landlord like me who just owns a couple of units, you're going to be much more likely to give each one of those tenants a lot more attention. Plus, you're going to be more sensitive to pricing the units fairly because a vacant unit for a small landlord can be financially devastating. Going back to the watch list, let's start by looking at the watch list overview page, which gives us a pretty good snapshot on what's going on out there in New York and exactly what they're looking for. You see, they say there were a total of 463 buildings that house a total of 9,384 units, and over the last time period reviewed, these buildings averaged a total of 55,202 housing preservation and development violations. The violations are broken into 2 buckets: immediately hazardous violations, which include things like issues with no heat, no hot water, rodents, or lead-based paint, and then hazardous violations, which include issues with lighting, painting, signage, and fire safety. Again, most landlords on this watch list own hundreds of units, so it's not super surprising that they have some open violations, because that's just bound to happen when a landlord is spread so thin. I should point out though that most of these violations are avoidable with good regular maintenance, or if you just put a property manager in place. So in my mind, there's really no excuse to have a building fall onto this watch list. The locations of the worst buildings to live in are spread out all over New York, but the biggest clusters are in just 2 parts of town. First is in this pocket down here in East New York, where you have Brooklyn, Brownsville, Bushwick, and Crown Heights. And the second biggest pocket is this area up here, where you have Upper Manhattan, the Bronx, and Harlem. Looking at the legend here to the right, it's not surprising to see that the majority of these buildings are in lower income areas. Most of the red dots are in areas that are shaded pretty dark blue, which means the median income is less than $50,000 in a lot of buildings, and even less than $10,000 in some buildings. Any of you guys who live in New York or who have just visited there know that it is not cheap even to just exist in the city, especially when you add up transportation, housing, food, and utilities. So it is wild to hear that there are some people living in the city with less than $10,000 a year in income. The About section of the watch list webpage gives us a pretty good idea of the criteria and the methodology methodology of getting onto the worst landlord watch list. They tell us here that to qualify for inclusion on the watch list, a landlord must own one or more buildings that meet the selection criteria. Then they say that landlords are ranked according to the total number of average HPD violations at their buildings that meet the criteria, and the landlords with the most average of open HPD violations for the 12 months are deemed one of the 100 worst landlords in New York City. So to put it simply, you need to own a lot of real estate in New York City, and you need to have a lot of open violations on the buildings that you own in order to be deemed eligible to land on this list. Down here they tell us that only multifamily rental buildings are eligible. Most co-ops and buildings with fewer than 3 units are excluded. And you can pause to read this entire section if you want, but the gist of it is that they have a pretty specific and advanced formula for determining a building's score based on the type of the violation, the severity of the violations, and the average violation per unit in the building. They go on to explain that some buildings are exempt from landing on this list if they're, say, for example, going through a major rehabilitation. And there's a ton of resources at the bottom of the page for landlords if they want to learn more about the landlord laws in New York City or if they want to dispute anything. The most common types of violations are those immediately hazardous and hazardous items that we talked about earlier. And I don't feel like New York City's expectations are all that crazy. As far as heating is concerned, New York's heating season is defined between October 1st and May 31st. And during those months, if the temperature outside is 55 degrees or less, then the building temperature thermostat needs to be set at 68 degrees or higher. Regarding hot water obviously needs to be made available to tenants 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, and the temperature needs to be a minimum of 120 degrees or higher at the tap. On rent increases, landlords cannot increase rents without offering a lease renewal. And other things that the Housing Preservation and Development are looking for are functioning smoke detectors, functioning carbon monoxide detectors, lead-based paint, window guards in units where children live, pests, and bars on fire escape windows. If you are a tenant and you have any of these issues in your building, you're almost guaranteed to have that issue accepted by the HPD and a violation issued to the landlord. You can report pretty much any bad or unsafe living condition by just dialing 311 on your phone and telling them what's going on. Most of the buildings in New York City are old, some of them dating as far back as the 16 and 1700s, so it's not a huge surprise that a lot of these buildings require regular routine maintenance. But if a landlord establishes some good consistent maintenance routines, even on these really old buildings, then they should be able to mitigate a lot of these problems before they even start. I picked out some of the buildings that had the highest numbers of violations just to give us a little bit of a visual on what some of these poorly maintained structures look like. A lot of them surprisingly don't look all that bad from the street, but they definitely look old, that's for sure. This one here is located at 1133 Boston Road in the Bronx, and it is loaded with more violations than any other building on the list. There are only 51 units in this building, and they have had 783 violations over this past year. On the surface, it looks like a pretty standard red brick building, and I wasn't able to find any interior shots, but something tells me it's pretty rough inside. The listing on apartments.com says, "It's time to love where you live." Kinda sounds like false advertising to me for a building with almost 800 safety violations in a year. Next up, we've got 568 Lincoln Avenue. This building is located in Brooklyn, and it's also heavy on the violations with 471 recorded in the past 12 months. But check it out, you can see how small this place is. I actually didn't even think that small buildings like this were eligible to make the list. There's literally only 3 units here. So yes, you heard that right, 3 units with 471 safety violations in the past year. Either the tenants who live here are all just complaining for no reason every single day because they hate their landlord, or this is officially one of the worst places to live in the city. 400 West 57th is up next on our list. This is a pretty cool looking place. This one was built back in 1881. This building is located in Manhattan. It's got 157 units in total, and it has had 648 violations in the past year. Now, to be fair on this one, I did find a report that a heavy renovation is being planned for this building because under the previous owner, the building deteriorated to a state of extreme disrepair. So even though the residents here are living a nightmare now, things are probably going to turn around for them sometime soon. Last up is a building in Staten Island at 280 Park Hill Avenue. This is another big one. It's a 137 unit building owned by a company called Kimso Apartments LLC. They have had 331 violations here over the past 12 months, which from the street is pretty surprising because it looks really well kept and maintained. All the windows look pretty new, the gates and the stairs look pretty recently painted, and the lawn and shrubs are all manicured really nice. But this just goes to show that you can't judge a book by its cover, because 331 violations here mean that there were about 3 complaints per unit just in the last year alone. I feel like I need to give an honorable or not so honorable mention to the landlord who gave me inspiration for this video. His name is Jason Korn. Sounds like Jason was the worst landlord in New York City for several years in a row, and he definitely made headlines across all the outlets that I follow for achieving that milestone, if we want to call it that. Jason actually completely fell off the worst landlord list this past year, but not because he just magically became a better landlord, but instead because he actually ended up selling a lot of the buildings that helped to land him on this list to begin with. There are a ton of articles on Jason and how he is notorious for having rat and roast infestations, lead-based paint issues, and for evicting a bunch of people during the pandemic. But maybe he just realized that he was in over his head with all of these properties, and that's why he's selling some of them now. Anyways, if you enjoyed the video today, guys, if you could hit that thumbs up button down below for me, and remember to click subscribe before you go too. The numbers shoots up and down a lot, but only like 30% of the people who watch my videos are actually subscribers. But that's all I've got for you guys this time. So until next time, see ya.